Karen.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the public role of the Humanities. We are now recording, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker today, who lots of you already know. And in fact, Amy is so excited to be with us here today that she's coming back again on Monday. So Dr. Amy King specializes in the history and memory of Italy's far right with expertise in memory studies and oral history, which you'll hear about today. Her research examines the role memory of secular martyrs has played in the construction of Italian national identity, arguing that martyr stories tell us something about how the nation and its citizens understand their history and identity. She uses methodologies including oral history, direct observation of commemoration ceremonies, and analysis of political attacks on monuments. She is currently writing her first monograph to be published by Palgrave Macmillan. Welcome, Amy. I'm going to now mute myself.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to sort of see you. So yeah, I specialize in the history and memory of the far right, but I have a research interest closer to home, doing oral history interviews with Bristol Dockers, which is the subject of the talk today. I also want to quickly mention that we have another special guest in the form of ACH Smith, Anthony Smith, who is currently muted, but will probably be unmuted right at the end for the Q&A. And Anthony is a Bristolian, well, he's from London, but basically Bristolian writer and playwright who has written a lot of plays that draw on local history. So he's written a lot about Brunel and the Suspension Bridge. There's hopefully going to be a play about SS Great Britain, but for today's purpose, we're really interested in his work with Bristol Dockers and the play that he wrote, which I'm going to talk a bit about today and we can discuss at the end. But just to begin, I thought I'd try and capture your thoughts on the Bristol Harbourside as our kind of opening. So I wanted to begin by throwing the stage back to you, unfortunately, sorry. And I'm putting in the chat, which hopefully goes to everybody, a link to a, what do I call this, a word cloud. And I wondered firstly if it opens, because it can be a bit temperamental, so I hope if you click that it allows you thumbs up if it works. Yeah, Karen's nodding. It allows you to put a couple of keywords in, but I'm just wondering if I say to you Bristol Harbourside, or if you were in charge of with explaining the Harbourside space to a visitor to Bristol, I'm wondering what kinds of words pop into your head, what you think of, what the structures are that you think of, the sights are, the smells, the sounds, just any kind of words that pop into your mind when you think of the Harbourside. If you could put that in the word cloud, it should hopefully appear right here. Social, industrial heritage, Spike Island, a tinny with the sunset, yeah, nice, especially during lockdown. Public, lots of tinnies, okay, so lots of drinking, it's a social space is what's emerging here. Vibrant, industrial heritage. Yeah, alive, colourful. Okay, great. Yeah, bustling, lively, Arnolfini, busy. Okay, fun, interesting. So that confirmed what I thought about. That when we think of the Bristol Harbourside today, it's very much split from what it used to be, right? All the words that you just came up with are very much about kind of social spaces, collective spaces of fun and relaxation, right in the heart of the city. And that's why I love it so much around there. And this project came to me after I'd been away in DC in the States doing a fellowship there, and I came back to Bristol, happy to be back in my city, and headed straight for the docks. And it just felt like the heart of the city, and it was where I wanted to be to kind of reconnect with the city after 6 months away. And I was looking at those cranes down there, which we so often associate with that space, and just kind of looking at them and thinking, as a memory studies nerd, they're kind of monuments to something, aren't they? That when you think of the centre of Bristol, I don't personally think of a particular monument, although probably now we think of Colston. But to me, this is the kind of monument to Bristol, those cranes that stand outside M-Shed. But there's just a handful of them, where there used to be around 30 scattered up and down the docks. And I started to think that this space is very much divorced from the industrial heritage that used to be at its heart. And this used to be a place of really hard work, manual labour, danger, sights and smells, incredibly bustling, but not necessarily the city space that we experience today as Bristolians living in 2021. Yeah. So this is what it used to look like. You can see some images. These images are from M-Shed's archive and Bristol Archive. And you can see just from that bottom right-hand image that there used to be cranes spread all along the docks, not just the handful that remain outside M-Shed. And they were used to haul cargo on and off ships, such as Guinness, which is something that crops up in so many people's memories of the docks for obvious reasons. But I started wondering if there was a way to represent and remember this hard work without just turning it into a kind of nostalgic playground. You might have noticed that those cranes, if you walk below them, the ones outside M-Shed, some voices talk to you. It's incredibly stylized, and they're not the original voices, I don't believe, of the people that worked there. So I was starting to think about how to kind of bring that labour back into the space of the former docks. So for me, the answer was oral history. There's a lot. We're so lucky in Bristol to have so many amazing heritage organisations, especially ones along the docks. You can walk from M-Shed down to Underfall Yard, take in the SS Great Britain. There are several kind of museums and other heritage organisations. So there's a lot of fact spread along that Harbourside, I think, but there's not much about the kind of lived experience and what it was really like for people who worked there. So I was trying to find a way to kind of interrogate the meaning of that space to the people who built it and in turn built, much of the city's economy. So I turned to oral history. So I wondered if any of you have ever encountered oral history. If you have, then please pop something in the chat. I've just seen Karen thanking us in the chat for teaching me the word tinny. So I wonder, has anyone ever encountered oral history? I know now, having watched, hopefully in time for this class, that video by Alessandro Portelli, that you kind of get what it is, but I wonder if you've ever listened to any before, or listened to the BBC Listening Project, which is broadcast on Radio 4, just conversations between people remembering a specific time or event. Just let me know if you have any experience there. But broadly speaking, as shown in the slide on this, which defines it, oral history consists of spoken memories, stories, and song, and more importantly, the study of these. And it's a way to communicate and discover information about the past. And this is historical source material that's gathered and held in archives kind of globally now, which is really fantastic. But one of the brilliant things about it is you can create digital sources that can then be shared in lots of different ways, which is what I am going to talk about with the Dockers project. So Katreya has been doing a bit for her own dissertation, which is super cool. I would love to hear about that maybe at the end. So when did oral history first emerge as a research method? In many ways, it's the oldest form of research that there is, in that we're, human beings by their nature are storytellers, from gathering around the fire pit and sharing stories of what was going on. Oral cultures and societies predate, written historical sources by a long time. But in a formal space, there were lots of voice gathering projects, lots in America. The Library of Congress has a lot where they were trying to gather, for example, the folk songs of various American states, or the experiences and voices and in fact songs of enslaved people. So it kind of started in that area, and in the 1940s became a formalized methodology, mainly in the States. But Italy, and I suppose this is where my interest kind of started, is really a leading country in terms of oral history. And in the 1960s, the so-called shoeless historians emerged, going around and collecting voices and folk songs and things with their recorders. And these weren't historians from the kind of formal spaces of traditional academia, hence the shoeless terminology. But they were really kind of gathering maybe, what do we call it, sort of regional dialects, songs, those kind of traditional aspects of Italian culture. And then there's a growth in it in the 1970s and 80s. And the real kind of big players in Italian oral history are Luisa Passerini, who has done some amazing work on Italian fascism and memories of it, and Alessandro Portelli, who probably remains the leading oral historian globally, having worked in the States for a long time as well as Italy. What I find so exciting about oral history, and this is something that I use for my work on Italian terrorism in the 70s, is that memory, as this quote says, and history really confront each other across the tape recorder. So often they contradict each other, and that's really the kind of meat of our analysis as oral historians. I'm reminded of a book called Testimony by Dori Laub, I think is the name, who writes about the speaking to a survivor of Auschwitz about the liberation of the camp. And this survivor vividly remembers and swears by the fact that a large number of chimneys were blown up with the arrival of their liberators at this camp. And it's such a strong memory in the survivor's mind. And it's a woman, and she insists upon a particular number of chimneys. And in fact, there weren't that many chimneys there at all. And the interviewee starts to say, oh, I didn't realize there were that many. And the survivor is really kind of adamant that there were so many things, and has this real kind of epic memory of this explosion. And what's fascinating is that space of contradiction between history and memory, and what the survivor is testifying to is the importance of that event in her biography, and therefore in her memory. So those kind of discrepancies are what I'm really interested in, particularly in my Italian terrorism research. And before diving into the Dockers, I just want to talk a bit about co-authorship, and just pull out a couple of the themes that Portelli talked about in the video that you mentioned, that you watched, sorry. And so co-authorship, I think, unlike many other historical sources that you might work on as a historian, oral history interviews are created through a dialogue. They need two people to be done. You have to go with a certain set of questions that you ask somebody, and then you might respond. And as much as you try as an oral historian not to kind of interject with your own responses, and you kind of keep your poker face and you nod and you try not to do the ums and ahs, of course it happens, just even through your selection of questions. But it might also be the very first time that somebody's has asked an individual about their life story. So often you'll hear people saying, oh, I've never really thought about that. And then they start kind of recollecting their experiences, and they might never have thought through that particular time in their lives. And so you're shaping the dialogue by asking them in the first place. And the other thing I wanted to pull out, which actually relates to something that Antti and I were discussing yesterday based on our respective experiences of interviewing the Dockers, is this idea of an interview, un intervista. The interviewees are in control. They have the knowledge that you want, and you're there to listen. And as Portelli says, it's not a technique, it's an attitude. It's about going in with openness and just listening to the stories as they arise. But it's also about being observed and observing. And I noticed, as I'll say shortly, that Anthony's interviews were done while he was write it or preparing to write for this play. And so he went in saying, you know, I'm a playwright and I want to hear your stories. And when I listened back to his interviews, the Dockers approached the interview with Anthony in a very different way to how they approached it with me, saying I was an academic at the University of Bristol. And I was a bit jealous, actually, because Anthony got straight in with the good stories and I got a lot of facts and kind of the less exciting kind of historical information. I wanted the lived experience, but it took a while to kind of break through that perhaps barrier between someone coming from a university context. So a brief history of the Bristol City Docks. I've got this fabulous video, which is only a couple of minutes long. If I play it, could you just give me a thumbs up or something if the sound is okay? Otherwise, I'll send you the link directly. But I just want to make sure we have the kind of background already. Great.
Until the mid-18th century, Bristol was the UK's second largest shipping port, with its rapid growth rooted in the tobacco and slave trade. The huge tidal range on the River Avon carried the big ships 8 miles along the gorge from the sea to the city centre docks. By the 1760s, the river became congested, with large ships regularly getting stranded in the mud at low tide. With trade being lost to Liverpool, the dock authorities urgently needed a solution. This is the original plan from 1767, which proposed damming the river with an adjacent lock. However, this presented a problem. It destroyed the tidal flow that carried the ships to and from the sea, and so a new cut river was proposed around the harbour to keep the tides flowing. Engineer William Jessup put forward the final plan, which was approved by Parliament, and work began in 1804. By the time it was finished in 1809, the floating harbour had cost almost twice the original estimate of £530,000. During the Victorian age, the harbour's shipyards constructed larger and larger ships, most notably Brunel's SS Great Britain in 1843. Ironically, this hastened the decline of the city docks by proving the feasibility of large cargo ships. By 1972, 2 huge docks had been built at Avonmouth, rendering the floating harbour redundant as a freight dock. Since the 1980s, millions of pounds have been spent.
Okay, I'll stop it there because that was the bit that I'm actually most interested in, is up until the kind of 1970s and the closure of the docks. But yeah, just to say that Bristol was kind of competing with Liverpool in terms of welcoming trade. And it was this sort of process of containerization and the city being so, the docks being so narrow, that stopped us being able to kind of continue to operate as a city dock. They couldn't offload these massive ships that were able to carry this large cargo in kind of standardized containers in the same way that some of the other docks like Avonmouth were able to do. So I wanted to do an oral history project interviewing former dockers, and I was really fortunate to enjoy some free PR from the Bristol Post, who published a couple of pages about the history of the docks with lots of lovely photos, and some smaller papers like the Bristol Pigeon also carried little adverts asking people to get in touch with me. And I used Facebook and other kind of local history groups to try and target the children or grandchildren of people who used to work on the docks. And in doing that, somebody said to me, you should contact ACH Smith, who wrote a play all about this. And I looked it up and got a copy of the play, and the play is called Up the Feeder Down the Mouth, and I am definitely not the best person in this room to discuss that, so I will leave that to Anthony. But just to say that it was performed in 1997 at what is now the Bristol Old Vic, and Anthony has some brilliant stories about the dockers being there at the at those shows, and according to the Cliftonites who frequented the theatre, not knowing how to behave, and it descended into a kind of more interactive play than perhaps was foreseen by the playwright. And then it was performed in 2001 at Shed, inside the big sheds looking out onto the docks, and at one point a large ship pulled up as part of the play. And it's fascinating to me as a memory studies person that the play about the memories of the Bristol City Docks featured so many times in the Dockers' memories of the Bristol City Docks. The kind of layers of memory were really fascinating there. And I was interviewed on BBC Radio Bristol with one of the interviewees to kind of try and drum up a bit of interest. So Anthony's interviews are archived at Shed, which was a brilliant find for me because there was all of this rich existing material that had been collected in the late 90s. And many of the Dockers have since passed away since Anthony did those interviews. But their voices are kind of captured and preserved at Shed. So I listened to lots of those, there's a lot there, and did my own oral history interviews with those Dockers who are still with us. And then went through the process of kind of listening to them all and pulling out key themes that I could bunch together into sort of topic tracks, which I then put up along the city docks themselves. I wanted this to become a walking tour and where you would listen to something that related to where you were standing. So in the example that I've got here and that image, there's a sign up that you would scan with your mobile phone. So it's just a QR code because it was about £15,000 cheaper than doing an app. You just scan this QR code and it starts to play you tracks relating to memories of Guinness in Bristol and the hijinks that went on there and the thieving that the Dockers did of that Guinness. And that's at the point that the Guinness used to be unloaded. So those red dots on the map show you where the signs were, but are no longer, unfortunately, because the council took them down after a certain amount of time. But they're all themed, and I built a website, which is bristoldockers.co.uk, where you can download either the whole track or just the separate segments. But if you download the whole track, it lasts the same amount of time as a slow amble from Shed on the far right down to Underfall Yard at the far left of this slide. So you can listen to the stories that relate to where you're standing. And one of the things that really emerged, and people started sending me photos, which was so nice, was the kind of collective hijinks and the playfulness of the Dockers. And there's a real tension between the real hard labour of that space. It wasn't a place for skivers, and the kind of stresses of not knowing how much work you would have for the day, and going up every day to what they called the pen, where you would be given work or not, and then having to go home, with not having a day's work. On the one hand, you had that side of things, but on the other hand, there was just such joy in their memories of the camaraderie, and this is a real life lived in the collective, and the playfulness of the Dockers. So I'm going to play you a bit now. I hope you can hear. A thumbs up would be appreciated.
From time to time, I would in fact go into the Dockers canteen. They were strict, obviously for the PBA staff. There was a PBA staff and canteen in the Dock office at Queen Square, but there was also a Dockers canteen down by the Pen in Prince Street, where food was much cheaper. And I suppose I've always seen myself as a bit of a radical, a bit left wing, and I thought it was the right thing to do to sort of, throw in my lot from time to time with the Dockers, and some tremendous individuals, with their black books. Black book were key to the whole system, because of course you only became a Docker if you had a black book, which meant that you were recognised by the National Dock Labour Board.
Everybody had their own special table. You had one table, and it was all pigeon fanciers. They all kept pigeons. They all had a lot of it was from around Noel, and they all had these big pigeon lofts out in the gardens. And one guy, he used to work in a granary and used to wear Wellingtons. And he'd go out for dinner and he'd fill his Wellingtons out with corn. He'd go, and he'd go in and out like that. He never ever bought any food for the, peas or anything. Was it pigeon peas? What he fed on?
It was entertainment and dancing. It was great fun. It was all right. And then, like when we went on our day trips with the Dockers' wives, they always paid for the Dockers' wives. There was 4 coaches from Prince Street to take the children to Weston for the day. And that's when I got made friends with the wives and that, because it was a good life for the wives as well. And then we came back from Weston in the day, and all the men then were in the club, and they did a buffet for everybody. It was a real community spirit, wasn't it, Mike?
Yeah.
We used to go other places as well, besides seeing, going down to Weston, and we'd meet each other down the club as well. Because I used to go out on my own, didn't I, when the kids were little? I'd meet them down the club, wouldn't I?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're supposed to like go in with your husband and that, but the one on the door is say, "Oh yeah, I know you. Go on in."
Because I'd go by and I'd knock on her. He was in
Yeah, I worked in insurance in Queen Square, and I worked in the back on Welsh Bank, and I'd be sat there typing, and I'd hear a knock on the window, and he'd go, "All right, 5 minutes, I'll be down the club."
I loved her laugh so much. It's so infectious. So that was one of the themes that really emerged that I loved. And they also talked about the nicknames, which we'll come back to shortly. And they had some incredibly inventive nicknames for one another. But so having created this soundscape, I started thinking about what else I could do with it. And I wrote to the Bristol Ferry Company, who run that little yellow ferry that zips up and down the river, about possibly doing something on the water. And their outreach officer and I came up with this puppet show, working with an Aardman animator. So Kim on the right is the outreach and engagement officer at Bristol Ferry, and Adri on the left is a animator who's worked for Aardman and other big businesses like that. And they were amazing and created a shadow puppet show based on these stories to really kind of bring the research to new audiences. And it played over Docks Heritage Weekend 2018 and 19, right? Where are we? Yeah. And reached young families and just kind of a younger audience than would perhaps have necessarily been interested in Docks history. Naturally interested in Docks history, and we boarded down by Arnold Feeney and got on and zoomed up the river a bit and stopped at various places along the river to listen to those tracks, and then got off at a pub, sang some sea shanties and looked at some kind of objects relating to Docks history, and then got back on. They were so amazing that I think it would be remiss of me not to show you a tiny bit of footage of them doing their shadow puppet show. So this is Mike and Diane, who you just heard talking about pigeons. And you can just see, this is just from a rehearsal, so it's not great footage, but you can see how they converted it into this show.
Yeah. And couples.
Everybody had their own specialty. You got wood team, and you pigeon fanciers. You kept pigeons. You had, no, it's right, no. You know what? Pigeon outside the garden. I want to go. You should work in a clary. You should work Wellington.
I'll stop them there, but I could watch them for ages. So I mentioned the nicknames, which is something that MShed play on a lot every year when they do the Bristol, what do you call it, Heritage Weekend, Docks Heritage Weekend, and they usually have a big display up of these amazing nicknames that people had for each other on the docks. Things like, well, we'll get into it. I can send you some information on it, but things like 18 months because someone had half an ear, so it was ear and half, and lots of kind of really creative ones that Anthony and I really fell in love with. And so we talked, Anthony and I, about doing a sort of semi-revival between his hit show Up the Feeder Down the Mouth that had been just, as I said, so prominent in people's memories. So we wanted to kind of pick up on the popularity of that and the importance of that to the city's cultural history, but also incorporate some of my Dockers stories that I'd collected as well. So we put together, and Anthony wrote the brilliant script for something we called The Names, with the Dockers nicknames as the kind of thread that ran through this short play. And it was performed over Docks Heritage Weekend at Shed a couple of times, and we're hoping to do it again. But it was all about the kind of music and the stories, a real kind of amalgamation of voice and song. And it was so lovely to watch people sitting in the audience at the end after the big round of applause. We realised that many of them were former Dockers and they were catching up with each other for the first time in however many decades. I remember really clearly someone going over to Mike, who was the voice talking about the pigeon fanciers, and saying, "Are you Yellow Bird?" And they'd obviously never even known each other's real names. They'd only ever known each other by this nickname, and they caught up for the first time in however long. So that was a real buzz and just a really lovely thing that we don't get to do that much with our research.
To speak to them, you called.
Oh, I won't play it now. I think we don't have enough time for the Dockers names. But finally, just to say that the project kind of then grew into something that really focused on this sort of multilingual aspect of the city docks. As someone with a background in modern languages, that was one of the things that really excited me, was hearing about how this, right in the centre of town, you would have walked up and down the port and heard Spanish and Italian and French being spoken, Norwegian, lots of different languages being spoken as the Dockers brought over whatever project it was from their particular country. And one of my interviewees remembered skipping school. He was a kid, he didn't work on the docks, but he grew up around there. And he tells of skipping school and running down to the docks in his lunch break because they might throw you an orange and sing you a song in their language. And I just loved that. And it was, just after Brexit, and I felt like, right, I'm going to bring these languages back into the city centre with a bit more research. So I worked for someone in the Spanish department we went to the Bristol City Archives, and we found this collection of notebooks produced by a ship spotter who used to note down all the ships that came in and out of the port and what they looked like and the people that were on it and what it was carrying. And he was just a real enthusiast, would be a nice way of putting it, I suppose. And we picked one year from his notebooks and looked at the cargo that was being brought in and out that year. It was 1959, and worked with a creative sound technician who created this kind of more experimental soundscape that draws on lots of different music, different languages, and follows this ship spotter as he walks around the space. So it's a kind of more fictionalized way to bring voices and sounds back into the space. Not oral history, but pretty interesting nonetheless. So just to finish, in the future, this was very much, I should have said at the start, this is something that I did during my PhD because the funder allowed you to get access to a bit of money to do a work placement. And I managed to package this up as kind of professional development rather than just purely academic stuff by working with lots of these heritage organisations. But it was just me doing it, with the exception of, collaborating with Anthony or sound engineers. But in terms of coming up with the ideas in the project, I was kind of just going where the wind took me, which was lovely in some ways, but it was a bit off the cuff at times. So I think I'd probably like to structure it a bit better, maybe develop an app, because the project is basically homeless now that the council have taken the signs down, which is a real shame. So people only listen to it if they know about the website. And I think it would be a lovely idea to develop a participant research project, kind of helping the Dockers to do oral history interviews with each other, and capture these voices and archive them before they're lost, but really get them doing the work of the oral historian rather than me coming from a university. And I would love to find more women's voices as well. It is, of course, a male space, undeniably, because of the workforce. But there are women who do crop up in the stories, and the Dockers' wives, you know, that I mentioned before about this being a life lived as a collective, and that extended to the wives as well, as Diane put so nicely in her memories, where she talks about the social aspect. So I'd like to make that, you know, a bigger part of the soundscape and make it slightly more representative of the wives' experiences. So I think I'll leave it there and open up to any questions for either me or Anthony, who can speak more about kind of historical plays and bringing history to public audiences through that medium. If anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Amy. That was so interesting. And also, I want to put your website on my phone so that if I ever come back to Bristol, I can do that as my walking tour. Well, let's hope soon. But yeah, that's super interesting. I would love to hear about these plays and what inspired them.
From Anthony, where is he?
That means you'll have to unmute yourself.
Here he goes.
I'm unmuted.
Tell us more about your plays on Brunel or the Dockers.
Well, it started in the 1980s when the then director of the Bristol Vic, John David, got in touch with me, and he said, I opened a drawer the other day and I found some money in there that I didn't know I got, and what I want to spend it on is a play to celebrate the 150th birthday of the Great Western Railway, built by Isenberg and Brunel. And I'd been doing some playwriting work in Bristol, so he knew me, so he asked me to do it, which I was glad to. And I can't remember the order things happened in, but the idea came up very early in the course of working with a cast of 6 actors and about 6 other people behind the scenes, that we should go out and record interviews with people who had worked on the railway. But Debbie Shaw, the director, had the very good idea that I didn't have to do all of those. For instance, we sent our electrician, the Sparks, to interview the signal box man on the railway, because they would have, you know, something in common in their background. So I wrote quite a bit of that play, dramatized it, but there was a good deal of verbatim in there as well. So I'd done that in the mid-1980s, that was. And then some years went by, and as is the way with my profession, not a great deal was coming in my direction from at least the Bristol Vic. And then suddenly Andy Hay was in charge of the Bristol Vic, and he was very different and much better kettle of fish. And in 1996, the city put on a thing called the Festival of the Sea, I think it was called. And I knew Andy, the old Vic, and I said, are the city getting you involved? And he bitterly, from experience, said, oh no. They've appointed someone to run it and we've heard nothing. The city's only permanent professional theatre company isn't invited to take an active part in a thing like that, which is ludicrous. So with Andy, I went to meet the city-appointed man in charge of that festival. Weirdly, his office was in what had previously been the Pen, for the Dockers, which is still there, just over the road from the Arnolfini in Prince Street. And we talked to a man I have always referred to as Mr. Striped Shirt, who was a retired banker. We said, theatre, and said, oh, yes, we'll be doing some theatre. We've got some acrobats. And we said, well, fine, but what about the history of the Docks? And what about music and songs? And he said, oh, music, yes, we're going to have music in. And Andy, I remember, said, who's your music director? And he said, that's my wife. She's very fond of music. And both of us were just in despair. And walking back along Prince Street, going back to the theatre, I remember, I'm not exaggerating, Andrew literally punched a wall. He was so frustrated with what was going on. He punched a wall. And then he said, we'll do it ourselves. That was the crucial moment. And he commissioned me to go out and find what turned out to be up to 50 Dockers and their wives, because they've often got a big contribution to make about that experience, and a few seamen. It was mostly about land-based Dockers, but we talked to men on the ships as well. And that's when I did the work that I recorded, well, I know what it's 30 odd tapes, I think, 2-hour tapes. That's 60 hours with about 50 interviewees. And they came up. I mean, what I love about Bristol, I've lived here for over 50 years. What's always going to keep me here is its sense of humour. It's wonderful, dry, irreverent sense of humour. And there's so much of that in the way the Dockers talk about their experience, their work experience. And there is nothing, in my experience, more revealing than hearing a man or a woman, hearing them talk in their own voice about what it was like to go through whatever the subject is. And I've got a little anecdote which I got from the poet Ted Hughes, which will make Amy laugh because she kids me about the fact that I knew him. In his early days, just after he'd left university, when he was still struggling to make a living and to put food on the table for him and Sylvia Plath, he did some radio work for the BBC. And a producer at the BBC had decided to make a half-hour programme about the Battle of the Somme in 1916, in which the British Army did less than well. And some researcher had got a list of people that Ted could go and interview with this tape recorder. And Ted told, I won't try and imitate Ted's gorgeous Yorkshire voice. Ted said to me that the first two people he went to interview had each been quite senior officers. And Ted said, between them, they gave me such a good description of what had gone on that I felt, well, I've probably already got the programme, but I better go to one or two more of these people that the researchers tracked down. And so he said the third man I interviewed had been a squaddie, just an ordinary soldier in the trenches. And I'll try and do Ted's voice because it matters. He said, I spoke to that man, and when I uttered the name Somme, he said, ah. And Ted said, then I knew what it was like to be in that battle, which the two senior officers could never have given me if they talked for days. It's that quality in a man's voice, in this case, merely a sigh, that you get an experience transmitted, and that I think is what you as oral historians are after, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things that I experienced was the change in vocal tone and expression when you move from, you know, the dockers being lively individuals with their nicknames, and then you start talking about the closure of the docks and how they had to walk from the city centre to Avonmouth to try and get a day's work, and the tone of it changes completely and conveys the sort of emotion of the whole thing. We've had a question from Daniela about I was wondering if you could talk about the value that you see in creating a space where people can tell their own stories, and would you describe this as empowering? And it's an interesting question. I really hesitate to do that because I think that the imbalance of being a female, young, middle-class academic, creating the space for an elderly male, predominantly working class group to feel empowered is very problematic. And that was something, I don't know what the solution is there, and it's something that I think about. And I think perhaps maybe the participant observation, participant project where you kind of show, you know, discuss oral history with the dockers themselves, and then they go off and do it, is possibly the space where it might, you know, we might talk about that kind of participant project. I definitely felt that there was quite a lot of frustration from some of the dockers that I interviewed with what the space of the docks is like now, in terms of it's for leisure, it's very quiet, it's kind of highly sanitized in many ways, and it serves a fantastic purpose in the city today, but it's not the space that they worked on in many ways that they built. And I think that they appreciated the chance to have that space captured in their memories and then put into an archive, so that it's going to be there hopefully for you know, however long these files remain uncorrupted. Yeah, so they definitely seem to take some pleasure from being involved in the project, but I'm not sure about empowering. I think it's a kind of difficult thing to wrestle with, those sort of power dynamics there. But yeah, thank you, Danny, for your question.
You were talking, am I, yes, I'm unmuted. Let me remain unmuted. You were talking about the nicknames, which were extraordinary. And one docker, unsolicited, after I'd interviewed him, he then got in touch with me by post, and he said, "Oh, you were asking about nicknames, here's some." And he typed up 500 nicknames that he remembered from his time working on the docks. And I used a few of them in the play, but I used a lot more in a song which was a kind of wind down song at the end of the show. So, you know, people standing up and beginning to go home, because they couldn't listen to them all. But let me read you just a couple of verses from Nail in the Boot, Lion Tamer, Hobo and Omo and Emu and Mo, Soft Talking Joe, Rack and Ruin, Turkey Neck, Crazy Horse, Elbow, Apple Face, Yellow Bird, Bonker, Bent Nose, Porky McPie, Rackman, The Vicar, Cat Strangler, Canesham, Two Faces, Cod's Eye, and I could go on and on. There's so many of them. And
there was one called Woolworths because he used to steal so many things. There was the one called Woolworths, wasn't there? Because he used to steal so much of the cargo.
Yeah. There was, when you ask them, where did that nickname come from? The answer is always funny. Because, you know, these were, you mentioned earlier, I mean, they were working in very difficult conditions. They were very ill paid, and they weren't guaranteed work every day. And there was no, well, there was a very small, it was called, you got your green stamp, I think it was called, which gave you a pittance for a day's work that you hadn't got. And when you put people in collectively, a group of working class men, particularly in that situation, they've got to maintain their pride, and they do it by solidarity, that we're all in this together and we'll all take the piss out of the bosses and the people in charge. And that's where the humor comes from. It's the same in Liverpool. Probably other places I wouldn't know about.
I would love to do something in other docks and try and connect, you know, ones abroad and try and set up a similar thing in ones in Naples or something, or Spain, and try and kind of create this kind of global mesh that links all of these places together. But that's a large research grant away.
This has been so interesting, and really, like, I love that it's very local, obviously, because I think everybody can picture the space. Everyone has a sense, their own sense of the space. So this really adds an amazing layer to it. But I also think it just speaks so well to our unit at large, right? When we ask that question, what is the public value? What is the public role of the humanities? And I think thinking about both the oral history and also the play, which you know, uses the voices, uses the names, uses the sense of the people, right? And also gives it back to them, right? Because you said so many people actually came to watch it. So it's for others, but it's also for them. I think it's an incredibly interesting, and to be honest, it's something that I would never, like, if I'm just being honest, I would never think of, I would walk by that dock and not think about that history, right? It's something that I feel like is just invisible. It's something that just sort of disappears, and I love that this brings it to life again and lets us see those layers. You should lead walking tours yourself.
Yeah, although we don't need to because it's all recorded, so you can just listen and have a nice time. There's still one sign up if anyone happens to be walking in front of M-Shed under the cranes. There's one there that you can scan and it'll take you there. They forgot to take that one down for whatever reason.
Very, very interesting. So thank you, everyone. If you come up with more questions, it is not the main purpose that Amy is coming on Monday. However, you will see Amy and me again on Monday, so you can save those questions for Monday as well. And if you have questions for Anthony, you might have to funnel those through Amy, but I'm sure that he would be happy to answer them if possible. I think that's a good sign. Thank you, everyone. It's lovely to see some of you, and we'll see you again on Monday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so
Thanks
much
for coming, Anthony.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Anthony.